Welcome to Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we explore Lexington's history and people. I'm your host, David Bryant, and in each episode, we will feature a guest who will share a piece of local history. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast. I'm your host, David Bryant, and today I'm talking with Dale Henley about the Marquis de Lafayette. Dale is an attorney. He is the retired general counsel for Eastern Kentucky Power. He is a former adjunct professor at UK Law School, and he also teaches French with the OLLI program. And importantly, he is the past president of the Lafayette chapter of the SAR. And I just have to say, Dale knows more about Lafayette than anyone I know, so we're really happy to have him here today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So as we all know, in 2025, Lexington is celebrating its 250th birthday, but 2025 also marks an important milestone. In 1825, Lafayette embarked upon a tour of the United States, which included a stop in Lexington. It's interesting that living in Fayette County, it's surprising how many people don't realize what an influence Lafayette had. It's not always, people know about Lafayette High School, Fayette County, of course, but it's interesting to kind of talk about what an impact Lafayette had around the nation, the world even. So just to get us started, Dale, could you tell us a little bit, who was Lafayette? What can you tell us about his early life, where he was born, about his family, that sort of information?
Well, thank you very much. Lafayette was born in the Chateau of Chavagnac, which is located in Auvergne, which is in south-central France. He was an only child. His father, Michel de Lafayette, was a colonel in the King's Army who at the age of 27 was killed by the English during the Battle of Minden in Europe. His mother was an heiress. Her family was an extremely wealthy family with large land holdings in Brittany, which is in the far western section of France. It's a very interesting story because after his father was killed, and he was only 2 years of age, his mother moved to Paris and installed herself in what we call the Luxembourg Palace. That's where her father and her grandfather were residing. Lafayette was left behind, and he was raised by a grandmother and two elderly aunts, and was not with his mother until he was called to Paris when he was about 12 years of age. He was enrolled in the finest schools that Paris had to offer, and he was also enrolled in the Versailles Riding Academy, where two of his classmates would become future kings of France. His great-grandfather was a general in the King's Musketeers, and so it was very important for him that his great-grandson continued the tradition of military service to the king. So he enrolled him and got him commissioned as a lieutenant in the Musketeers at the age of 13. It's hard to imagine what were you doing when you were 13 years old, and he was already enrolled in the Musketeers. But his grandfather was not necessarily completely satisfied that his job in raising his great-grandson was completed, because he arranged for a marriage with the daughter of the Duke Diane, who was the second most powerful family and person in France after the king himself. When they married, Lafayette was not quite 17, and his wife, Adrienne, not quite 15. The point of the story is that the Duke Diane had a personal army, and he appointed his future son-in-law and gave him the rank of captain in his personal army and sent him to Metz, M-E-T-Z, which was on the Austrian border. And it was there that Lafayette really had his first very absorbing moment with the cause of liberty and freedom that was ongoing in North America in the revolution of the colonists against the British king.
All right, very good. So you mentioned that he became familiar with the concept of liberty. And so that was very much an inspiration for him to come to America, correct? And so can you talk a little bit about what inspired him to come to America and participate in the Revolutionary War?
Yes, it's very interesting, and there's a bit of irony from the standpoint that at the time that Lafayette was growing up in France, Louis XVI and all of the French kings were absolute monarchists. And yet the education that was afforded to young Lafayette and to the sons of many of the nobility was a very classical education which studied the values of democracy as they were practiced in ancient Greece and later in the Roman Republic. And he was also somewhat familiar with some of the early writings that we now call the Enlightenment. So he was largely influenced by those concepts of individual freedoms and rights and liberties. But the turning moment in his life was a chance dinner party on August the 8th, 1775, when he was assigned to the garrison at Metz. And at that time, the brother of the English king, Prince William, the Duke of Gloucester, was on a military tour of France and had dinner with him and others. Now, at that time, the Duke of Gloucester was in a strained relationship with his brother, King George III, but he spoke very glowingly and very favorably about the colonist quest for their own individual liberty and freedom. And Lafayette absorbed all of that, and as he later wrote, and I have the quote with me, he said, "As a result of that chance encounter with the Duke of Gloucester, I became excited about a people fighting for liberty. The conversation had a strong influence on my imagination. Before I left the table, I had the idea of going to America to fight in this quest for liberty. This cause to me seemed just and noble." So I think you see where the inspiration came from. But there were other things too. If you remember, I mentioned that his father was killed by the English. Mm-hmm. That was very important to him to sort of settle that score. And of course, in North America, about 10 years before the American Revolution, there was something which we called the French and Indian War. And as you know, the English prevailed and essentially drove the French out of North America, except for that very small conclave which we call Quebec today. So that was a source of great disparagement and humiliation that the French had suffered. So all of these things, I believe, played a part in his decision to leave France at the age of 19 and go fight alongside General Washington in the cause for American independence.
Yeah, it's amazing. How did he, did he just come over and call up somebody and say, "Hey, I want to join the revolution"? How did that work? How did he get involved?
The story of Lafayette is really almost legendary. It's largely unbelievable. Whenever I speak about him, I always ask my audience, what were you doing when you were 19 years of age? Well, this young man, at 19 years of age, had access to enormous wealth. As I mentioned to you, his mother was an heiress, and after she moved to the Luxembourg Palace in Paris and called him to Paris when he was 12, he was only there for about a year or perhaps a year and a half when she died and her father died. And he suddenly became essentially the wealthiest young man in all of France. So money was always at his disposal. Lafayette was raised in Auvergne, and even though he was of nobility, if you want to use that term, he really enjoyed associating with the people who made up the region of Lafayette. In fact, the place where he was born is known as Chateau Lafayette or Chavagnac. So he was always much more comfortable with country folk, with plain folk, as opposed to the courtly life that was offered at the palace in Versailles. So anyway, at the age of 19 and not really wanting to have what he would consider to be a rather dull life, even though it was a life of luxury, and certainly his career as a military officer was well fixed, being the son-in-law of the Duke Diane and already presented to the royal court. That's not what he wanted. He had more of an adventuresome spirit. So at the age of 19, and for the reasons we've all already talked about, the inspirational dinner party and other things like that, he decided that he would leave behind his wife, his country, and violate the king's orders not to get involved in the American Revolution. and he had the resources to purchase his own ship, which was called La Victoire, or the Victory, and he sailed along with a crew of about 30 on a roughly a month, maybe a little bit longer voyage, and landed in Charleston, South Carolina. And we can take that up if you want to in a few moments.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Wow.
It is wow. I mean,
that's unbelievable.
I mean, it's just, the whole thing is unbelievable, and it gets even more unbelievable as we continue.
So I imagine he was able to bring resources that made him appealing to the cause.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He was actually solicited, among other things, by Benjamin Franklin and a fellow by the name of Silas Deane, who at that time was the colonial representative in Paris. And they were looking for European officers to come and serve in the American War. At that time, he was given, or at least he was promised, the rank of Major General, in large measure because of who he was. His name was well known. He had enormous wealth, and what a political asset, if I could put it that way, to have him join the cause of American independence. So yes, he was highly coveted, and when he arrived in Charleston, it took him about another 30 days to navigate a rather difficult trail from Charleston up to Philadelphia, which at that time was the colonial capital of America. And he presented himself to the Continental Congress, and he asked only that he be allowed to serve as a volunteer for no pay. Well, that would, of course, very attractive to most employers right there. And, of course, they recognized as well that this was someone who needed to be a part of our campaign. But because he was 19 years old and with some professional military training but had never seen actual battle, there was some skepticism about actually making him a commanding general in the Continental Army. So as far as the Continental Congress was concerned, at least initially, his title as Major General was going to be honorary, as opposed to actually having command. And in fact, as it turned out, he was confirmed in that role on July the 31st of 1777, and on that very evening, there was a dinner party in Philadelphia that was given in honor of a fellow whose name we all know, George Washington. And at that dinner party, the two of them met. And as we like to say, they hit it off.
Right. So as far as his participation in the revolution, was he successful? Did he fight a lot of battles? What do you know about that?
Surprisingly so, George Washington was skeptical of this young man, not yet 20, and completely untested in battle. But as I said just moments ago at this dinner party, they hit it off. Washington recognized something exceptional in Lafayette, and on that very evening invited him to become a part of his personal staff. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. He did distinguish himself in battle. He was a brilliant military tactician, and in fact, he was so good that as the war moved from the Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Delaware area into the South, primarily into Virginia, Washington gave command of the Virginia campaign to Lafayette, and he had two principal objectives that he charged him with. One, he was to track down, and as Washington said, hang on the spot, the traitor Benedict Arnold, who at that time had been, he had converted from being a general in the American Army to a general in the British Army and was conducting some very serious raids against colonial resources and supplies in Virginia. Washington detested Benedict Arnold, and as I said, told Lafayette to hunt him down and hang him on the spot. And secondly, he told him that he wanted him to harass and control British General Cornwallis, who was then in charge of the British campaign in Virginia. And not only was he a brilliant tactician on the battlefield, as we know, because the victory at Yorktown is largely due to him, the fact of the matter is Washington recognized that he was a great advocate for the American cause and asked him to return to France largely during the year 1779 and 1780 to advocate at the French court for even more support, which he did. That was his mission, and he came back and reported to Washington Mission accomplished, because you will soon find a huge French expeditionary force, some 6,000 soldiers, some 12 capital ships under the command of General Rochambeau. Now, when Lafayette had returned to France in order to secure this additional support, he, of course, envisioned himself as returning to America at the head of this expeditionary force. But he was still a very young man in his early 20s, and the French government, even though they agreed with everything he had to say, decided that the command should go to General Rochambeau, who at that time was about 55 years of age. The beauty of all of this is the fact that when Rochambeau landed in Newport, Rhode Island, he subordinated himself, his ships, his soldiers, to the generalship of George Washington. So there was no question as to who had overall command of this now joint French and American alliance.
Wow. So he's 19. He comes to America. He has this very successful career in the American Revolution. And then, so really his tour in 1825 is many years later. So so many things happen in his life that we really don't even have that much time to go into here. But when he makes his tour of 1825, can you kind of give an overview of why he made the tour and where he stopped and who was involved in organizing the tour?
Yes, in February of 1824, President Monroe, who, by the way, was a comrade in arms with Lafayette. You ask about Lafayette's contribution on the battlefield. Shortly after joining George Washington's personal staff at the Brandywine, he was wounded. He was shot in the leg, was severely injured, and it was James Monroe, who also at that time was a captain in the Revolutionary War, who commiserated with him and helped to nurse him back to health. So it's very interesting. And also James Monroe would be very actively involved at a time during the French Revolution when Lafayette's wife was suspected of not fully complying with the revolutionary ideas that every citizen should be full-heartedly in support of the French Revolution. There was a strong possibility that she herself would face execution at the guillotine, and it was Monroe and his wife, who at that time were the American representatives in Paris, who were largely responsible for saving her life. Long story short, in 1824, he invites Lafayette to return to America. It had been 40 years since he was last here. It was on the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of America's independence that was one of the motivating reasons that he was asked to return. He did come back. He thought he was going to come back and tour really the original only 13 states. He planned for about a 6-month visit. That 6-month visit turned into a 13-month visit, a 6,000-mile journey that covered a visit to all 24 states, including a 2-day visit here in Lexington on May the 16th and the 17th of 1825.
Yeah, it was a really big deal. I mean, the cities he visited had parades and many events. He met with dignitaries. Do you know a little bit about the places he visited when he was in Lexington and where
Well, you're absolutely right. From the moment that he landed in New York City in time until the time he left some 13 months later, everywhere he went, people wanted to see the last surviving major general of the Revolutionary War. And really, to be perfectly honest about it, outside of Washington and Jefferson, maybe Franklin, his name was the most recognized name of all those associated with the Revolutionary War. Really quite a remarkable story. And in Lexington in 1825 was a fairly sophisticated cultural center, but not a huge town. And yet the local newspapers reported that a crowd of 10,000 people greeted him when he came to Lexington. I mean, that's an incredible amount of people for 1825. He spent 2 days here. It was a wonderful visit in Lexington. He was welcomed at Transylvania University by a fellow by the name of Horace Holly, who then was the president. He was given an honorary Doctor of Laws degree. He visited many old wartime acquaintances in the Lexington area. He visited with Mrs. Lucretia Clay, who was the wife of Henry Clay, and actually presented her with a miniature portrait of himself. He visited what's called the Lexington Female Academy and was so impressed with Lexington as a cultural center at that time because they had Transylvania College. And they also had this really fine, what I guess we would call a finishing school for young ladies. And he was super impressed with all of that. So yes, he had a wonderful visit here. It was 2 days in length. He was wined and dined, as we said, and just had a marvelous time here.
In terms of his legacy today, I mean, can we talk a little bit about his contribution to democratic ideals and advocacy of natural rights, especially like his position on slavery at the time? Because I think a lot of people don't realize this part of Lafayette.
Well, I would say this in terms of his legacy, and that kind of operates on a couple of different levels. I am convinced, and I think there are a number of historians who are also equally convinced, that we don't have our country as we know it today without Lafayette.
Wow.
He was that instrumental in securing the victory at Yorktown, and really he was the cement that held together the French and American alliance. Washington had an army. Yeah, it was a ragtag army, largely composed of state militiamen, I guess you could say. And even though he had an army, there was one thing that he knew that he needed in order to be successful against the English, and that was a navy. And there was only one country in the world that had a navy that was almost as equal in strength to that of the British. And of course, I'm talking about the French. So he understood that the French alliance was super important, and Lafayette made that alliance possible. So I think as an American, my legacy is that he won the cause for freedom, at least at that time. It would not have happened at that time without Lafayette. So that's very, very important. And again, that legacy that goes back to that time continues today because France is America's oldest and, in some respects, most reliable ally. And even though there are differences from time to time, that alliance is still very strong, and it dates from the time of Lafayette. In terms of his commitment to individual rights and liberties, he was dedicated to those propositions his entire life. We've already talked about his early inspiration and motivation for coming to America to fight alongside General Washington. He advocated for individual rights, both for men and women, when he returned to France. At that time, France was still experiencing basically feudalism with an absolute monarchist on the throne in Louis XVI. But his experience in America taught him that there was great value in the American experience of searching for true democracy in a representative form of government, which we call a republic. So when he returned to France, he advocated for these reforms. Now, he knew that the French had been governed by an absolute monarch for 1,000 years. So he realized that the best solution to that was a compromise in which France would have a figurehead king and yet allow the people to have some voice in the government through a republican form of government. So he advocated for that all of his life, and of course advocating for individual rights of freedom of religion and expression. Most importantly of all was the position that there needed to be an emancipation of slavery everywhere that it existed. And he fought for that all of his life, and at every opportunity, even in America, he would advocate for that position. As a matter of fact, it's reported that he said during part of his travels in 1824 and 1825, he said that I would have never dreamed of using my sword in the cause of American freedom if I could have conceived that thereby I was founding a land of slavery. So he was committed to it, and I think that's probably one of his greatest legacies. But also on an individual basis, I can say to most people, he was steadfast in what he believed, and he never, ever compromised or waived his principles on what he thought was noble and important.
As I mentioned a moment ago, there's so many more things in his life. So it was just a truly fascinating life. And there's lots of great books that are available, and you've brought some of those here with you today. One that I would recommend, this Hero of Two Worlds by Mike Duncan, that's a more recent one. That's quite excellent. And I actually heard about that by listening to another podcast. Do you recommend other sources?
Both of them. The Hero of Two Worlds by Mike Duncan is certainly a wonderful book. Also, there's a book simply entitled Lafayette by Harlow Unger, Unger, which many people say is sort of the Bible or the most definitive work on Lafayette. There's also another one that's fun to read, and it's called Lafayette and Brandywine by Bruce Mowday, Mowday, which I find very interesting. And of course, Lafayette's visit in 1824 and 1825 was captured by his secretary, a fellow by the name of Lavoisier. And it's a 500-page chronicle of all the places he visited, all the speeches he gave, all the dinners he attended, and all the accolades that were extended to him during those 13 months of visit. So any of those would be a good place to start with Lafayette.
Yeah, and coming in May to commemorate his visit to Lexington, there are exhibits and events that are going to happen in Lexington, including at the Central Library. Can you talk a little bit about the exhibits and events that are coming up?
Yes, we're very excited to talk about these events, which are scheduled for May, which will be here in another 6 weeks. The entire month of May, in the rotunda of the main library in downtown Lexington, there will be an exhibit of what Lexington looked like in 1825 when General Lafayette arrived. It will be supported by traveling panels supplied by the American Friends of Lafayette, which explain all of his life from the moment of his birth until his death in 1834, all the accomplishments in his life, and they will also be available in the rotunda of the library. We will have a dedication of the official Lexington-Fayette-Urban County historical marker on Friday, May the 16th at 3 o'clock in what we call Gratz Park. That's Gratz, Gratz Park, which is located in downtown Lexington and which in 1825 was the location of Transylvania College. That event will take place, I think I said, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That evening of Friday the 16th is what I've been working on, and I am especially proud of, is what we call the Lafayette Dinner. I have traveled in France the last 2 summers. This past summer, I had the opportunity of presenting the ceremonial wreath at the tomb of Lafayette in the Picpus Cemetery on July the 4th. Every year on July the 4th, there is a ceremony in which the American flag that has flown for 1 year is lowered and a new flag is raised and will fly for the next 365 days. This ceremony dates to July the 4th, 1917, when General Pershing arrived with the American Expeditionary Forces to aid the French in World War I. So I had the privilege of standing at the exact spot that General Pershing had stood on 116 years before. But while I was there at the cemetery, a woman approached me, and she invited me to come back to France the following summer and to travel with her to places that were important in Lafayette's lifetime. This woman is Sabine Sablonnier, who is the 7th grade granddaughter of Lafayette. She is coming to be with us at the dinner party on Friday evening, the 16th of May. We have also issued an invitation to the French ambassador to the United States, Laurent Bill, and his office tells me that he is still planning to be with us. We will also have, and I am especially proud of this, we have been able to identify and will have with us that night people from roughly the Lexington area whose ancestors either served with General Lafayette during the Revolutionary War or who met him during his visit to Lexington in 1825. So these individuals will talk about who their ancestors were and what became of them. So it's going to be a very, very fun evening.
Wow, that's amazing. There's lots of things for people to get involved with and to participate, and I encourage everyone to take advantage of those opportunities. Dale, I've asked most of the questions I had prepared. Was there anything else you wanted to cover, or did you have any?
Well, I would just like to encourage your listeners that if they are interested in some of the things that we've talked about, particularly being present for the dedication of the historic marker, visiting the library, and certainly the Lafayette Dinner, there is still an opportunity to participate, and I don't know how best to tell those people to get a hold of me, for example. Can I do that? Can I give my email address?
Sure.
Is that appropriate? Dale Henley, DaleHenley, 8848 at gmail.com. So I would be glad to hear from you.
And hopefully maybe your dinner will be as consequential as the dinner that were Lafayette.
I think it's going to be a very memorable evening.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dale.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast. And please remember to recommend the podcast to friends. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm. Or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm David Bryant, and we'll be back with another episode next month.